With the hat or without the hat? You decide.
With the hat.
Not you.
With the hat. Women fuzzy.
Okay.
But backwards.
Well, thanks everyone for coming. I'm surprised how many of you are. Pleasantly surprised. We have now room for the late arrival. That is good. Okay, so now I have to start talking. Otherwise you're going to think it's very weird. Okay, so I'm going to try and keep this presentation to about half an hour, and then if people still want more, then I'll open up to questions and dialogue and conversations and stuff. I've got a loose structure. I don't want to just be reading to you, because I find it's pretty dead. Yeah, couldn't we all turn off our cell phones, please? Which is the first thing that any public speaker says. It's the amount of practice. Yeah, so I have a quite loose structure. I'm going to read a little bit, and then I'm going to talk, and then I'll read a little bit more, and then I'll talk a little bit more. And hopefully I'll bring it all into some sort of sense. In the end, we shall see. I've got my notes on the blackboard here. Well, the first part is not stuff I'll get to unless we carry on afterwards. That's the deeper stuff, but these are my talking points. Alright. So, oh yeah, I was going to ask people, just bring up like the subject of movies. Obviously this book is about movies. I'm not actually going to talk about movies very much today, like specific movies, because it narrows it down. But obviously I wrote a book about movies. Obviously I have a very deep and lifelong relationship with movies. And so I did want people to think about, just briefly before I start, like if there's been a movie in your life that has had a deep and lasting impact. Maybe it's your favourite movie, or maybe it's just a movie that you just have very strong feelings about, or that takes you back to a time in your life, whatever it is. But if you could just hold in your mind, assuming you can find one, that movie, and just contemplate like the relationship that you have with that movie. This is what I'll be exploring today without going into specific movies, but is my relationship with movies and what it means, what I've come to understand about it by writing this book. So yeah, has everyone got a movie? Is everyone able to think of a movie that was special to you? Okay. So have you ever thought about, you don't have to answer this rhetorical question, have you ever thought about why? Why that movie is so special? Because the answers that I found, to the movies that were special to me were not just surprising, they were really startling, actually quite disturbing sometimes, but really unexpected. Like I was completely unconscious, really, of why those movies became so important in my life, and why movies in general. Okay. So I start here with this line, which is from one of my special movies. It's called The Wild Bunch. It's a Sam Peckinpah movie. And there's a line in that movie which is, "We all dream of being a child, even the worst of us. Maybe the worst of us most of all." And that movie always breaks my heart. It's a movie about violent men, self-destructive men. And there's an awareness in the movie of this, that men who end up this way are trying to get back to some lost innocence and doing it in all the worst and most self-destructive ways. But I brought it up now just to begin on that question of, what is it that connects us to our childhood, what is it that separates us from our childhood, what is it that causes us to long to return to that experience or that state of childhood, insofar as we do. Movies were a necessary refuge in the face of the incomprehensible trauma known as childhood. The desire to be someone else is central to the appeal of movies, fantasy. Movie stars make a living pretending to be someone else. A successful movie star turns him or herself into a public figure, a celebrity, a living icon. That's a weird sound, right? What's that? Very impolite to ask. To have an idol means to focus your attention so ardently on it that it blots out your own identity. So this is what the song is about, seen and not seen. This character is trying to find an identity, and so he creates it, or he finds an image, and he holds it in his mind persistently over the years in order to try and transform himself into that image. And this is what I did as an adolescent, as we'll get to eventually. My image was Clint Eastwood. And I literally did what David Byrne says in this song. Actually, David Byrne later became my idol, so it's something weird going on there. Because then I started trying to turn myself into David Byrne. And Clint Eastwood and David Byrne, they don't really mix together very well. So anyway, this is what the end result of that experiment. Okay, so... okay, yeah, so movies and how to disappear. It occurred to me when I was preparing this presentation that one of the points in this book, one of the talking points, is that why we love movies, all of us, is we get to disappear and yet still be there. We get to experience life, watching people do things without being seen. So there's no anxiety or fear of being exposed, or confronted or challenged. It's absolute comfort and safety, but engagement in a simulation of life. And it occurred to me that what I'm doing here is the opposite of that. I'm actually putting myself behind the screen, you're the audience, and I'm completely exposed, and there's nowhere for me to hide. Literally. You can run there, but very strange. My reputation has been ruined. So that tension, is intriguing. I'm not sure where I'm going to take it at this point. It's central to how movies impact us, because we put ourselves into them and we want to disappear into a movie, but by doing so we take on the narratives and the qualities of the character we identify with. By disappearing into that, we take on those qualities. So we think that we're just kind of innocently gazing into this virtual realm, but actually we're letting it into our inner space. We're letting it possess us. That's the process of movie watching, is identification with the character and the narrative, being possessed by it and disappearing into it. So although it feels very safe, it actually, in a certain sense, isn't safe. It's actually quite dangerous in a strange way, like in terms of what we identify with, we become. Okay, so I'll read a little bit more. While I was writing what became the first chapter of this book about Jonathan Letham's The Disappointment Artist, I hit upon a reason why movies imprinted me so deeply. It occurred to me that they, along with Marvel Comics and the books I read as a child, intercepted an early formative process in which I was struggling to make sense of the world, and they became integral parts of the identity I was assembling. They were like a matrix for self-awareness to grow inside. Mythic narratives acted like code for creating an operating system to run my hard drive. Of course, human beings are not computers, but it's convenient language so you can understand the process that I'm trying to describe. Because I mixed elements from pop culture with direct experiences, my memories became a kind of cultural implant or screen. There's a psychological term which is screen memories. When memories of life are too unbearable, we create a sort of dissociative screen to protect ourselves from the actual memory, and then we remember the simulation. So that's the parallel that I'm making now. Figuring out which is roughly what this book is about. It was early traumas which drove me to seek compensatory immersion in fantasy in the first place. So the nature of the fantasy being escaped into indicates in a series of subtle correspondences the shape of the reality I was trying to escape from. So that was the process of writing this book, was trying to understand why I've been drawn to these fantasy narratives, and by doing so, mapping the shape of my own trauma without being able to remember it, intuiting and deducing. Okay, so point number 2 is about thinking and survival, matrix creation. Now this is an idea that I got recently from Canada's most infamous character, Jordan Peterson. I wasn't going to credit him, but somehow I felt I had to. He got it from Piaget, and it is to do with the theory that thinking, which we all do, and we might or might not all agree is what our identity is most firmly kind of nested in the process of thinking, certainly feeling thinking. That the theory is that it emerged when our instincts were insufficient to deal with the complexity of our environment. We had to start thinking about how to act. And that thinking is a means of creating a virtual avatar self and a hypothetical scenario, and putting out virtual or imaginary self into the hypothetical scenario to see what happens. So I have to go this way, I have to go that way. Well, there's predators this way, what will happen? You know, there's trees, and so we create this virtual simulation, and then we enter into it so we see, you know, whether it's a good idea or not. And because of this, we didn't get killed every time we tried something out, because we could create this virtual self that would die in place of our actual self. So I bring this up because it relates to movies, obviously. That movies are like an externalization of that process. When we sit down in front of a movie, we're essentially entering into a virtual self that's been created for us, that is moving around in the virtual environment and having these vicarious experiences. So we're testing out what's possible for us as individuals. And so there may even be something innate in our programming relating to survival that makes movies appealing to us. But by the same token, there's also something dangerous and potentially pernicious about it, because if you think about, if movies are a surrogate form of thinking, then whenever we enter into a movie narrative, we're essentially, once again, it's the same point I just made, we're actually taking on all of those elements of the narrative as if they were our own creation. So we become kind of inextricably tangled up in these narratives that are created. So I think that's all about that point. Which means I can move on to the next passage. Okay. Generally, the safest form of behavior is imitation. Imitation is something autistic people are extremely bad at. This is why they are recognized as being autistic, because they don't imitate well, which means they don't get socialized. Because socialization is a form of imitation. We watch how people behave, we copy it, we adapt it to suit ourselves. Basically, we fit our own forms of expression with those we observe around us, and then we're socialized. Autistics don't do this very well. I didn't do it, I couldn't do it very well, that's why I really literalized it by finding characters in movies and actors and pop singers. I mean, all adolescents do this to a degree, but I took it to an extreme to actually consciously imitate. And I would get busted. I'd be at a nightclub and people would say, hey, you're dancing like David Byrne. Because I would perfect the moves and I'd think, no, that's me. Anyway, the Clint Eastwood thing didn't work so well. I don't think anyone, actually, maybe one person said I looked like Clint Eastwood. Anyway, that was actually a digression. Imitation reduces the number of variables and therefore the chances of getting it wrong. Socialization is largely a process of trying out various kinds of imitative behavior and through a process of elimination settling on the ones that work, that adequately represent our inner experience while allowing us to be received to function in the outside world. This is tantamount to saying that we can only become as authentic as the world permits us to be. So that last passage feels like I want to save that because it won't make much sense without some background. Okay, so when I was growing up, I didn't have any idea about autism. It wasn't like today where my odd behaviours caused my parents to see therapists and psychiatrists and, you know, wonder if I was autistic. I didn't begin to identify as autistic until I met Michelle, and she, well, basically told me I was autistic. So I checked it out, and okay, maybe I am. And then I looked back on my childhood, and I actually found there were all these characteristics. So, for example, I was very serious, didn't smile and laugh. I would go off and be by myself all the time. I didn't like to be touched. I didn't like adults to kiss me. I would put my head down if they ever tried to kiss me. And then they let me kiss me on the top of the head. A lot of compulsive nose picking, which I now relate to stimming, like autistic children. People often feel like they're outside their bodies somehow, and so they use forms of stimming to feel more present. I think now my nose picking was related to that. I wanted to be a mad scientist when I grew up. It was before I wanted to be a police detective in San Francisco. Post Clint Eastwood, before I discovered that. I wanted to be a mad scientist, and actually the guy who discovered Asperger's syndrome, who's Hans Asperger, he called it the little scientist syndrome. That was how he identified the Aspergerians, as they acted like scientists. So I had that. I also had this weird thing as an adolescent that I wanted to be a robot because I had insomnia and I had these night terrors as well. Maybe that's why I had insomnia, I don't know. So I used to fantasize about being a robot that had a switch on the back of my neck so I could just turn myself off at night. So things like that, like, you know, odd things that actually a lot of them my parents wouldn't even know about, some of them they wouldn't. But I always felt there was something wrong with me growing up, absolutely. I mean, always, but certainly as far back as I can remember. And then on the other hand, like my immersion in fantasy worlds was, I would say, unusually elaborate and creative. So I think it started with Winnie the Pooh. I would read and record Winnie the Pooh, and I had all these stuffed toys, and all my stuffed toys had names and superpowers. This must have been after I discovered Marvel Comics, which were a huge refuge for me. But yeah, so my teddies had superpowers, and I would send them on missions and battle, and I would also make my own teddies and I would repair them when they got broken down. So I was very involved in that fantasy world. And then with comic books, once I was really into comics, I started to draw my own, write my own comics, create my own superheroes and villains, so that was also this kind of creative immersion. And then when I discovered Clint Eastwood, which began my passion for movies, I started making lists, which is an autistic, an Aspergerian characteristic. I would make lists of all the movies I'd seen in numerical order, and all the movies I wanted to see, and my favourite actors, and then I would review movies. I had a filing system, alphabetical, and then I started writing scripts, and fantasizing about being a filmmaker, and then I would write reviews of the movies that I was someday going to make, and posters with the release dates and everything. So very, very elaborate. Like, you'd say if somebody was into Law of Attraction and The Secret, why wasn't this guy successful? You know, why am I not in Hollywood? Actually, that's what this book's about too. Because I realised that that would be the worst thing that had happened. Something was protecting me. But at that age, I was absolutely dedicated to making my fantasy as real as possible. So it wasn't enough just to escape into movies. I had to become, I had to somehow use my love for movies to actually create a vocabulary through which, and a currency through which to move into the world, to become a self. And by writing this book, I traced it all back to the autism and the trauma, whatever it was, forms of trauma that had caused me to be so isolated and cut off and self-immersed, and to need so badly to escape into fantasy. So that brings me to Clint, my personal saviour. And who here feels completely indifferent to Clint Eastwood? Do we have one? I'm not going to be offended or anything. I'm just curious because
from my autistic heart, I promise.
Yeah, do this one.
Well, I could say, you know, without embarrassment, that I was deeply in love with Clint Eastwood. And I never had, well, I shouldn't say never, but generally I wasn't afraid of going gay or anything like that. It wasn't that kind of thing. But I would hunt down every picture I could find of him and put them in my scrapbook, and I would gaze lovingly at these pictures. And it wasn't that I wanted to you know, marry him or even particularly to meet him. I wanted to be him. Like that was just the ultimate dream of somehow I could be that guy. And the weird thing is, you know, how did that begin? So, so here's the thing that sort of came together while writing this book. Like the first movie I ever saw, I'm not went on about that. The first movie I remember seeing at the cinema, or possibly anywhere, no, not anywhere, but the first movie I ever remember seeing at the cinema was Where Eagles Dare, with Clint Eastwood. And I just have this very distant sort of amorphous memory. Has anyone who's seen Where Eagles Dare? Not many, right? It's a movie about British agents, Richard Burton and Clint Eastwood disguise themselves as Nazis to infiltrate the castle to kill the guy, and you know, it's one of those movies. And Clint Eastwood's just the shooter in it. Richard Burton's the smart guy, and Clint's just there to kill as many Nazis as he can, and that's his only function. But anyway, at the end of the movie, there's this battle on the ski elevator thing, whatever you call this thing, ski lift. And I have this memory of a kid watching that scene. And as far as I can deduce, that would have been when I was about 5 or 6 or something like that, which means it was before our father left, because he left when we were 7. So that means there's a good possibility that we all saw that movie together in the cinema. That's my brother, my sister, me, my father, and my mother. And if that's true, and it's deductive, right? But that means that's the only memory I have of being with my whole family, which is making me all emotional now. Right? And it's watching a movie with Clint Eastwood. By coincidence? No, I don't think so. I also point out in the book, and this you can say is coincidence if you like, but Where Eagles Dare, the first letter of each word is W-E-D, wed. So even there, there's something signifying togetherness in that movie, which there's nothing in the movie about. It's not, you know, Sleepless in Seattle or Kramer's Kramer. So anyway, but it gets weirder. So, beside that, my first memory of seeing Clint Eastwood was Fistful of Dollars, which I still think is the best movie he ever did, pretty much. And I was about 10, and my brother was watching it on TV, and I was just doing what a 10-year-old does, coming and going, and I just watched it a bit over his shoulder and wasn't really interested. But still enough to remember that. And then a couple of years later, this was the turning point, it was Christmas, and Where Eagles Dare came on TV, didn't mean anything to me. My brother wanted to watch it, I guess, because he and I watched it together. And for the first half of the movie, I guess somehow, he must have said, oh, Clint Eastwood's in it, I want to see it. Although later I never knew that he never gave any indication he was a Clint Eastwood fan. But he must have said that, because I remember through the first half of the movie I kept saying, which one's Clint Eastwood? And I couldn't tell the difference between Clint Eastwood and Richard Burton, which is pretty funny if you know who they are, right? And he kept telling me, and then something clicked, and for the second half of the movie I was just gazing at Clint Eastwood. Love at almost first sight, to the length of the movie, and that was it. There was no turning back, and anyway, there wasn't really anything to add to that, I don't think. Writing. I'm just wondering what to know about writing. Yeah, I think that's the whole, all you need to know about me and Clint, really. And I'll now read the part that I thought wouldn't make so much sense if I hadn't given that background. Maybe some part of me is still inside the darkened theatre with my family. Perhaps the projector is still turning, the image is still flickering up on the screen, and while we may no longer be captured to them, there is still time and opportunity before the lights come up and we leave the theatre to discover just how and why they captured us. To really understand how the movie ends means going all the way back to the beginning. My whole life I have searched for one thing, a way to feel safe enough to be myself, to discover and express my inner experience and be received. But the self doesn't appear to be some fixed, finished entity trapped inside us, waiting for the right circumstances to come out. It appears to me more as if the self only comes into existence via the act of physical expression. It's a bit like how a character in a movie is created through the actor's portrayal. Until then, it's only words on a page. If we don't find the right social environment, the right people and surroundings, to express the innermost self and discover who and what we really are, we will remain an unrealized project, lingering our lifetime away in development hell. We will have no sponsors, no backers to help bring our soul project into being. So, I'll just try and wind it up then. I mean, there's something about even me doing this now, trying to complete, at least continue, the project of bringing my soul into being an expression that got sidetracked by my immersion in fantasy narratives, by my trying to be someone else. And yeah, I don't know if I can sum it all because there's so many different variables here, but although we can find a way of being in the world that feels safe and comfortable by imitating, and by taking on other people's beliefs and other people's narratives and losing ourselves in fantasy and acting out fantasy, we can't ever actually discover who we are, because who we are is something that's deep, deep inside of us. So, what's seen and not seen, and what I haven't got into, and I may not get into today, looks at that correlation between kind of strategies that we develop when our own development is arrested through faulty parenting and trauma and culture. And it's the society that we live in, that we're born into. We develop certain strategies to deal with that, and that attracts us to elements in the culture, movies, books, whatever it is, individuals, leaders, role models, that suit us in that strategy, but it's actually a compensatory strategy. And the problem with that is it's never really going to work, because we're actually looking for things that will reinforce our fantasy about ourselves. So that's not going to work, number one. And number two, that we actually live in a culture, the same culture that traumatizes us, that is creating these narratives precisely in order to trap us. And that movies are not what they appear to be, and not just because of the way that we use them to escape, but because even of the intelligence is behind movies. They're corporate products. They're part of a system, a power system, which certainly I would say was designed and developed from the start as a means of psychological indoctrination and manipulation, i.e. propaganda. But even if you don't want to go all the way to that paranoid perspective, they certainly have been employed for those ends. Like the potential of movies was certainly recognized very early on, not just for selling products, but for selling values, beliefs, ideas, behaviors. Humans are imitative creatures, and it was understood that the best way to control people's behavior is to direct their imitative strategies, like to lure them into imitating ways of behaviors that are appropriate to the culture that is trying to maintain control over our souls. So that's an aspect of seen and not seen too, which I'm not really getting into because I wanted to stay on the personal. But there's also a lot of interesting material how Hollywood and movies really are nested in this much larger sort of social, cultural program of manipulating and directing our behaviors and the political tools. But in a certain sense, and not to sort of contradict everything I just said, which possibly I might do, I see that as a metaphor in and of itself. The tyranny that we're trying to get free of is an internal tyranny, and certainly movies and all of this culture that we're born into has helped to cement that tyranny within us. But it's not the actual source of that. That was a very quiet, good baby. She probably didn't like the things I was talking about. Not me, my experience.
This is the tone of voice.
So what?
The tone of voice, and a soothing voice.
Right. Yeah, well maybe I didn't like the things I was talking about. I mean, trying to sum up and include everything, so you have a sense kind of the, how it all ties together, like the different elements that I brought up in terms of it being psychological, personal, spiritual, but also political as well, cultural. All right, well I think that that's plenty. I definitely went on for more than half an hour there. Not much though.
No.
So, so we can take a break. There's tea, there's strawberries and stuff. And anyone who feels that they've had their fill, obviously free to leave. We're free to leave at any time. Anyone